Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics on this very windy and very sunny afternoon. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Jonathan Earle. I'm the Associate Director of Programming here, and we're delighted to have you. When the diplomatic history of the early 21st century is written, one of the major shifts in focus historians are going to zoom in on is going to be from a policy of frequent emphasis on hard power during the Bush administration's first term and soft, or if you prefer, smart power thereafter. The Obama administration, and Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton in particular, has stated that the ideal foreign policy of our country should be based on smart power, which involves leveraging the full range of U.S. governmental tools, whether they be diplomatic or military or political or legal or cultural, into a tailored combination to address each unique situation America faces abroad. We all know that today we live in a world that is rapidly changing, an environment that is constantly different than it was the day before. Failing in post-conflict states pose one of the greatest national security challenges to the United States. And today we're fortunate to have with us Ambassador John Herbst, who currently serves as Secretary Clinton's Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. As coordinator, Ambassador Herbst is the department's and the country's leader in the development of the U.S. government's interagency civilian capacity to promote stabilization and reconstruction of societies in transition from conflict or civil strife. One of the ambassador's responses, and something he's in charge of that I think you're going to want to hear about today, is the Civilian Response Corps, a corps of civilian federal employees who are specially trained and equipped to deploy rapidly into these areas to provide reconstruction and stabilization assistance to countries in crisis or emerging from conflict, which has begun just last year. Tapping experts from around the U.S. government, the Civilian Response Corps represents a partnership of 8 federal agencies. So if you've ever tried to herd cats, I think that the ambassador could tell us if this is like that. The agencies are Department of State, USAID, Justice, Homeland Security, Treasury, Agriculture, Health and Human Services, and Commerce. Through this interagency partnership, the Corps is able to bring the full weight of the U.S. government to bear in stability operations. A lot of people that I researched today suggested that Ambassador Herbst was an ideal choice for the job of coordinator. He has a long and distinguished career in diplomacy. In 2003, he was appointed U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. During his tenure, he worked to enhance U.S.-Ukrainian relations and help ensure the conduct of a fair Ukrainian presidential election. You may recall the immediate outcome of this election was called the Orange Revolution, but if you've looked at the internet and the video of what happened on the floor of the Ukrainian parliament this week, you might be a little skeptical about whether that revolution has continued. It makes our House of Representatives look like a genteel cricket club. Prior to that, Ambassador Herbst was the ambassador to Uzbekistan, where he played a critical role in the establishment of an American base to help conduct Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. He also promoted U.S.-Uzbek relations in part by encouraging the government in Tashkent to improve its human rights record. Ambassador Herbst previously served as U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem. These are difficult jobs. Principal Deputy to the Ambassador at Large for the newly independent states, the Director of the Office of Independent States and Commonwealth Affairs, Director of Regional Affairs in the Near East Bureau, as political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv and at the embassies in Moscow and Saudi Arabia. Both the Presidential Distinguished Service Award and the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award were presented to the Ambassador. He received a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, Phi Beta Kappa, and a Master of Law in Diplomacy with distinction from the Fletcher School. He also attended Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, Bologna Center, and it is our pleasure to welcome to the Dole Institute Ambassador John Herbst. Welcome.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to start with a question about how you got interested in international affairs and kind of how you got started in it.
For some reason or another, when I was very young, I was interested in war. Maybe all boys are interested in war. And I began to read when I was still in grade school about the Vietnam War, the crisis in Cyprus. And by the time I was in high school, it seemed to me that diplomacy was something I might want to do. And so that's my interest from a very early age.
And how did you get started in it? What was your first role that you'd call related to it? And talk a little bit about your education as well, because some of the students may want some pointers on that.
I went to Georgetown as an undergraduate because they had a very good program in international affairs. They have a School of Foreign Service. And one thing I did, partly by luck, partly by design, was take a language, Russian as it was, seriously. To graduate from there, you had to have 3 years of a language, I think it was. And yeah, that's not very much for a hard language like Russian. But they also had a language school where they taught languages intensively. And I decided I would take the intensive course, which killed me my first semester because I got a C in a 6-credit course. But I buckled down and I began to learn how to study a language. And so when I graduated from Georgetown, actually, I also spent a summer in Leningrad studying Russian. So when I graduated from college, I already had a strong foundation. I wasn't fluent, but I was close. And when I graduated, I knew what I wanted to do first thing. There was the U.S. Information Agency, which has since been folded into the State Department, but it was an independent agency in the early 70s, ran programs in the Soviet Union. Probably anyone who's studied international affairs has heard of the kitchen debates between Nixon and Khrushchev. That took place at an American exhibit in Moscow, which featured an American-style kitchen. And starting in 1959, when that debate took place, we would run exhibits through the Soviet Union every year. And the idea was for us to be able to explain American life and try and put a hole in the Iron Curtain so people in the Soviet Union could learn about the United States. Anyway, they still had these exhibits when I graduated college, and I wanted to do it. I had to wait a year after graduating, but I did that. And that turned me into a fluent Russian speaker, and it cemented my interest in becoming and working in international affairs. And from there, I joined the State Department a couple of years later.
Mm-hmm. And you've been in the Foreign Service since then?
Since 1979.
Yeah. What has been the most rewarding aspect of the work that you've been doing?
What you can get out of the Foreign Service depends upon the type of person that you are. Some people love the fact that this gives them the opportunity to spend a large amount of time overseas and become truly acquainted with another country and other cultures and peoples. And I'd say that's probably the principal attraction for most Foreign Service officers. Others love being involved in policy. And certainly if you're interested in international relations policy, the surest way you will be doing it is to become a professional diplomat. Although it's also true that if that's your motivation, you're likely to be frustrated for substantial periods of your career because you're doing it at a relatively junior level. And even if you advance through the ranks and become a senior Foreign Service officer and even ambassador, you don't necessarily have the same impact on policy as a political appointee who's come in with a new administration who might be 15 years younger than you are. And certainly not nearly as smart, although he or she doesn't understand that. But people who are interested in policy also could find this career very rewarding. Personally, I've enjoyed both aspects. In other words, the policy side as well as the immersion in foreign cultures. And again, it's a very good career. People in it really tend to like it, although they also tend to complain a lot about the fact that their boss is not as smart as they are, or that they're not promoted as fast as they should be, or that they have to go to one not so pleasant post after another.
Mm-hmm. What is the, and I'm sure you have a number given where you've been posted, but what's kind of the highest tension situation that you've been in the Foreign Service?
I have, by choice, gone to places where there's been plenty of action. And I don't think I would point out one of my experiences over others as demonstrating more tension or more activity. I mean, for example, my first assignment was to Saudi Arabia, and I arrived there in April of 1980, which was, 5 months after fanatics had seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And that raised the question in Washington, is the House of Al Saud going to fall? And of course, here we are 30 years later, and they seem to be as firmly in the saddle as they ever were. And a few weeks after I arrived, you had the fiasco in Desert One when we tried to free our hostages in Tehran. And 4 months after I arrived, or 5 months after I arrived, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in what was the first of the Gulf Wars. And we were dispatching AWACS, these sophisticated planes for intelligence, to Saudi Arabia. So that was Saudi Arabia. I then went from there to work on the Israel desk in Washington. And there's always a crisis in the Middle East with Israel of one form or another. And from there I went to Moscow, and I was there for early Gorbachev, but there was plenty of action there, whether the Soviets were putting spy dust in the embassy or they were, in response to our kicking out Soviet spies, kicking out Americans from the embassy, or the summit in Reykjavik, which almost led to a major arms deal, and then diplomacy which led to a major arms deal at the end of the Reagan administration. And I was in Tel Aviv for the second Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was sending Scud missiles into Israel. And I was in Jerusalem where I participated in the Camp David summit, the second Camp David summit, the one that was not nearly as successful as Jimmy Carter's first Camp David summit. In fact, when I went to Uzbekistan in 2000, that seemed to be the first place I was not really on the front line of something. And Uzbekistan's a really interesting country, and culturally and historically, many, many fascinating aspects to it. But for my first few months, I was a little bit bored. But then Osama bin Laden solved that for me by attacking New York. And suddenly Uzbekistan was right there on the front lines. And so we were in the thick of the action. For 4 or 5 months, we went from being an ignored post to being at the center of action. And then, of course, Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, and now this job.
John mentioned that you were U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine. Can you just, I'm going to spend most of our time today talking about what you do now, but I'd like to get your assessment of the situation over there today.
Well, I have to first put out a disclaimer that I have no responsibility for Ukraine and do not officially speak for the State Department about it. Having said that, I'd make a couple of points. One, actually more than a couple. One, there's a general misunderstanding worldwide about events in Ukraine because people tend to look at what happens there through a false prism. And that prism is the government there heading in a pro-Western or a pro-Russian direction? And that's how the events that have been taking place there, certainly since my stay there, have been perceived. And so from that point of view, it seems like you've just had this extraordinary change where you formerly had a president in Ukraine who was clearly looking towards the United States and the West, and now, according to this prism, you have a president who's looking towards Russia. Well, it really ain't that way. There are elements to that which are true, but the best way to understand Ukraine is as a country which only relatively recently has become independent, meaning as part of the implosion of the Soviet Union, had not had much historical experience as an independent entity before that. Its historic existence had it as a borderland between various powers, the Ottomans, the Russians, the Poles, the Polish Lithuania, and a country which has clearly developed a sense of self and which has slowly but clearly been casting off the legacy, the unfortunate legacy of the Soviet Union. And I'm very lucky to have been in Ukraine, in Kyiv, when you had the 2004 presidential election and the Orange Revolution, because that really was a watershed in Ukrainian life. Not the quote-unquote pro-Western march of Ukraine, which is sort of this simplistic view, but it was a march away from a closed society. You had an effort to steal a presidential election that was unsuccessful. You had the reaction of society to that, which led to another balloting, a fair balloting, in which, as it happened, a pro-Western candidate won. Now, I know very well the current president of Ukraine, Mr. Yanukovych, just as I knew his predecessor. And what Mr. Yanukovych did in the wake of his defeat in 2004, because he was the one who did not win when the second flawed, very deeply flawed election was overturned, he decided to stay in politics, showing a great deal of gumption. And he decided he was going to play by the new rules in Ukraine, which was to build a political party, develop support, go out and lobby people to support him. And he began to do that within, I don't know, 6 weeks of his defeat. And I shouldn't say I got into trouble, that's not true. But I annoyed a few people in the camp of the perceived pro-Western president, Yushchenko, because I pointed out 3 months after the election that Yanukovych was the leader of the opposition. Because he was. And he was doing it, you might say, the right way. And so he won this election fair and square. And to the credit of the gentleman who lost the election, President Yushchenko, he presided over several fair elections to their Rada, their parliament, and then a presidential election. So we've now had like 5 or 6 legitimately democratic elections in Ukraine in a row. Now, what happened this week in the parliament, in the Rada, reflects the political fault lines in Ukraine. You had the new president and his team, they made a deal with the Russians, which the opposition parties didn't like. And because it's democracy, you could not simply have the ruling party and the president ram that legislation, endorsing this deal through their Rada. Now, of course, they were rather boisterous in the way they opposed it. But what this showed was a country where different points of view are right there on display for everyone to see. And that's an achievement given the legacy of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And that's far more important than whether the current president looks more west or more east. I would say Yanukovych, like Yushchenko, is ultimately concerned with Ukraine, but as he sees it.
Okay. Could you describe your current role in the State Department? Tell everybody what you actually do.
The office that I am in right now is called the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. That's quite a mouthful. This office is still a new thing. It was created in 2004, and in June of 2004, and it was created because our government recognized by late 2003 that our civilian operations in Iraq were substandard, that we needed to have an organized presence of civilians handling the non-military aspects of our operation in Iraq. So our office was created to begin developing that. You might say we had 2 principal goals. One was to organize the civilian side of the American government to conduct stability operations like in Iraq. And 2, to make sure we had the civilians with the right skills, training, and equipment prepared and ready to deploy for such operations. That was the initial motivation. Now, I was not there at the creation. I came in 2 years later. But those 2 objectives are very important, and they remain very important. But the office also realized early on, again, before my arrival, that if we're smart, we will deal with the problem of failed and failing states before you need to send in troops. In other words, we will get involved in conflict prevention. So the office began also to develop a capacity to do that. So our objectives are to develop a civilian capacity to prevent conflict in places where we have substantial interests, to run complex stability operations in places where we have substantial interests, and in order to do that, to have the civilians with the right skills and a systematized approach in our government for success.
How would you define smart power and how it fits into our overall foreign policy?
Well, I think people always like to think they're being smart. But the concept of smart power, as it's recently appeared, goes something like this. You have, there's a continuum in the development of a problem. Your advantage is to address a problem before it becomes too large, while it's still in a manageable stage. If you can get there early with what you need, it will be much less expensive, both in terms of money and in terms of lives, for you to solve problems. That is a core element of smart power, the conflict prevention side. A second element, we have a truly extraordinary military. It is unlike any force that's ever existed before historically. It has the resources to manage any military problem that arises. But not all problems, maybe not even most problems, that endanger our national security are military. You know, there's the old saying that to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, there's a danger that if we don't develop a civilian capacity to deal with the non-military national security dangers, we will use our military to solve problems for which it was not created. And we will be using the wrong instrument, which is by definition not smart, more expensive in all ways. So smart power also means having the civilian skills to solve these national security problems, so we don't need to use the military.
How does work on reconstruction and stabilization relate to U.S. military action in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, in those places, it's really a pretty simple understanding. In Afghanistan, we responded to an attack on our territory, and we responded by removing a fanatic government. We had a responsibility, therefore, to see the establishment of a new government which could begin to provide the type of services that governments need to provide. Clearly, our military had the role of removing the bad guys, but we needed to have a civilian capacity to help the new leadership in Afghanistan establish its authority and to oversee the provision of basic government services. You had a somewhat similar situation in Iraq, although the origins of the war are obviously a little bit different. But there too, you had the military going in, removing a government, a hostile government with enormous human rights abuses, and we had some responsibility for the establishment or reestablishment of order. And having civilians with the right skills is the efficient way to do that. Having said that, I don't think we should dwell too much or exclusively on large stabilization operations like Iraq and Afghanistan. As I've said, we've developed the concept and capacity to do conflict prevention. And what we want to do is be able to get into places where we have serious interests at stake and help shore up governments which are beginning to get a little bit wobbly. Or alternatively, to go into places where we know there's going to be substantial change and help ensure that that change does not lead to gross instability, which again threatens American lives or interests.
Can you identify some of those regions around the world where your office is taking a hard look, is trying to figure out what to do, and is providing advice and or resources?
Well, I hesitate to say we're involved, this country, and because we know that they're going to be falling apart. That would not be very diplomatic. I can answer your question in two ways without creating a diplomatic firestorm. One, there are a variety of institutions which produce indices of state competence. For example, Foreign Policy Magazine has one. There's a think tank in Germany called ZIF, Z-I-F is the acronym, which has one. The Central Intelligence Agency has one. And all of these indices talk about anywhere from 35 to 50 countries, which are either in, not all failed states, some are failed states, others are having governance problems. So you could easily consult those indices and see where conceivably the capability we're building might be used. I'm also obviously willing to talk about places where we are acting. So we have about 25 people on the ground in Afghanistan. That's actually a very small slice of our the American civilian presence there. But we are doing some specific functions which we are uniquely qualified to do. The most important of which is we are the folks responsible for civilian military planning. This comes back to the notion of organizing the U.S. government to conduct in a systematic way these complex operations. We have written the CivMil operating plans for all 12 American provincial reconstruction teams. We have done the same for Regional Command East, which is a large sector in Afghanistan, and Regional Command South. We created something at our embassy in Kabul in late 2008, a CivMil planning cell, which wrote the national plan for CivMil operations that was approved by Ambassador Eikenberry and General McChrystal, as well as our National Security Council just a few months ago. So we're doing that. We put an election team out at Ambassador Holbrooke's request within a few weeks a year ago to help troubleshoot the Afghan presidential elections, which occurred in August of 2009. We provided a strategic communications team in the same quick fashion at Ambassador Holbrooke's request last fall. So we've done those specific tasks in Afghanistan. When Secretary Clinton went to the Democratic Republic of Congo last August, she agreed with President Kabila in Kinshasa that the United States would provide assessments of 5 areas of life in the DRC, sectors like gender-based violence, economic governance, corruption. And we put together a plurality of people staffing the 5 teams that went out to look at these sectors. We provided leaders of 2 of those teams, and we provided overall coordination. And this was a classic, you might say, conflict prevention or mitigation function. We are right now involved with our special envoy for Sudan. There's going to be a referendum in the southern part of Sudan in January regarding the future status of South Sudan. This is part of the comprehensive peace agreement that was reached in 2006. This referendum may lead to changes. We don't know, but it may lead to changes. We have to be prepared for transition. I've given the special envoy 4 planners who are now working in his shop to prepare for the various contingencies. We've deployed 5 people to Sudan to begin to look at needs that may need to be addressed. We'll be deploying an additional 9 within the next few months, and our folks in the field will be identifying requirements which may require additional deployments. Even though we're only slowly developing our capacity, we've already deployed to 28 countries, and we've put 281 people on the ground, although mainly in very small numbers. But it's only been recently that we begin to develop a civilian response corps where we can put a large number of people out.
What departments and agencies are largely involved in these efforts, and how difficult, or how do you go about coordinating the efforts of all of those different departments and agencies?
Well, coordination is one of our principal functions. And so by now it's second nature. We established a process even before I took this job, so my predecessor, Ambassador Pasquale, deserves credit for this. A regular process involving the 8 agencies that make up the Civilian Response Corps, plus the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, of Labor and Energy. And we meet regularly to talk about both the abstract issues relating to developing a Civilian Response Corps and training them and equipping them, but also concrete questions as to where we might use these assets. So we have the coordination part down. It's actually one of our achievements.
Do you get involved in natural disasters like the earthquake in Haiti?
There's no reason for us to do natural disasters. The Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is part of USAID, does a terrific job dealing with such problems. what is necessary is to make sure there's good liaison between them and in that capacity and us in our capacity when a natural disaster could turn into a problem of political instability. But dealing with natural disasters, there are very able people doing this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're a career Foreign Service officer, and yet your office has only been in existence for the last 5 or 6 years. What tools as a diplomat does your office give to you and to other Foreign Service officers around the world in terms of dealing with problems that they didn't have previously?
I'm sorry, what tools does the office provide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In one sense, you could say the State Department's role overall is to do conflict prevention. And certainly the skills of negotiations, understanding political circumstances, figuring out solutions to political problems, these are all common to the entire Foreign Service. But those skills, while part of the package that we needed to run stability operations, and part of the package that we need to do in general conflict prevention, are far from the whole list of requirements. What we found in both Iraq and Afghanistan was that in order to help local authorities establish themselves, we needed experts in different functions of governmental services. So we needed people who knew how to establish a police force and a prison system, knew how to run a bureaucracy, knew how to run a health system, know how to plan a city or a town, how to farm, how to promote irrigation. And the Civilian Response Corps is something that we are creating in order to have on call experts in those areas. This is something completely new and something the department did not have before, the U.S. government did not have before. Now, you don't just want people with those functional skills because they're not going to be deployed to some abstract nation. They're going to be deployed to a concrete nation which has specific legal system, specific culture, specific history. So what you need to do is to have folks with these functional talents and form them into teams with people who know the countries where you're going to be operating to devise specific solutions which will enable the local government to reestablish authority, reestablish basic competencies. That's what we're creating. And this is an absolutely essential new tool that we need to protect our security, to save American lives, to reduce the need to deploy our military, and to promote our interests globally.
So would it be fair to say that those teams consist of individuals who have an expertise in a fairly specific technical area who are combined then with a group of individuals who have an expertise in the culture of the country?
Right.
Okay.
That's right. But for many of these missions, you'll need a whole slew of technical skills. You'll need people who know, again, things relating to justice systems, and people who know how to do agricultural work and how to organize a healthcare system. So you're helping local authorities establish its legitimacy by providing basic services. Now, obviously, we're not going to come in and transform a country overnight. So we need to have goals which are realistic, sensitive to the local culture, relatively modest. Too ambitious is a recipe for problems. But there will be countries where we have no choice but to engage, as was the case in Afghanistan. So we need to have this capacity.
I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up to your Q&A, and I believe, Chelsea, are you the assigned mic person? If you have a question, if you would raise your hand, Chelsea will bring the mic to you. Please wait for the mic so that we can get it on our video today. My last question really, Mr. Ambassador, is related to the students who are here today. Many of them are very interested in international affairs in a variety of ways. What things would you say to them that they should do while they're still in the university as either undergrads or graduate students to try to prepare themselves for a career in international service?
If they want to work in the international field, learn the language. Make sure you have at least one foreign language. That's absolutely essential. And if you want to join the State Department, you will have a serious advantage if you have even a decent command, not fluency, in a difficult language, you get additional points for that in the Foreign Service test, or in the evaluation system, I should say. So, you know, you may find it boring, you may find it hard, but if you want to work in the field, make sure you have at least one language, better if you have two. But one hard language will do you fine to get started. That's the single most important piece of advice I could give. And my kids who are interested in this, that's what I tell them. Beyond that, you know, your major is not so important, but I'd say you want to have some economics. You obviously want to have some history and poli-sci. You want to be conversant with the principal issues of the day, and certainly to pass the Foreign Service exam, you have to have those things in some measure. Also, because there are growing numbers of young Americans who want to do this, the competition is harder than when I was interested in this, 35, 40 years ago. And that also means that if you get some international experience, that's to your advantage. Not essential, but to your advantage. So that a prospective employer sees you've actually had the opportunity to live over, I don't mean going on a 3-week tour of European capitals. I mean going somewhere and living there for at least a couple of months. And preferably a not so easy place, not so pleasant place. So people see that you're up for the challenges of doing business in interesting and not necessarily comfortable places.
When you say an uncomfortable place, you're talking about a place where English probably in the principal language and that is a developing nation?
You're not going to get by in English, yes. Yeah. And that's a, if you live in a place like that, that'll also speak well for you. And obviously to the extent you can do something which is related, that's even better.
Okay, wonderful. Let's open it up to your questions and answers. I'm sure that some of you have some questions.
Opportunity to talk to Admiral Mullen. He said the paradigm for use of the armed forces are actually becoming the instrument. Crisis someplace. First to appear, they're the first that are requested, and there seemed to be also a lack of confidence in the ability of the State Department to provide assistance in these fields. How do you see the relationship between the State Department and the Department of Defense evolving?
Your characterization of Admiral Mullen's views is very interesting. I would say it's probably not quite complete. Because something that needs to be added, and this is true also for Secretary Gates, is the recognition that the national security problems we're facing is becoming perhaps increasingly non-military in nature. That there's obviously an important component that is military, but there is a very important component that's non-military. And that we need to have a non-military response to that non-military problem. And I think in your characterization, there's you're accurately reflecting the frustration that the civilian capacity is still not there. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why our office was created, to provide that capacity. And I know there's frustration at the Pentagon. They've actually been our strongest supporters among all the agencies involved, the Pentagon. And I know there's some frustration there that this capacity we're trying to build, that we are building, I shouldn't say trying to build. The Civilian Response Corps has 944 people today. That's not an insignificant number, although we need to get larger. There's some frustration that we have not grown this faster, and I share that frustration. You've had unusual developments over the past 2 years where Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullins, and other senior Pentagon officials and military officers have been advocating for a larger civilian budget so that the civilians could develop the capacity to take on these roles. So I've had great support for my budget from the Pentagon. If we establish the capacity that we're setting out to establish, this problem will greatly diminish and ultimately disappear. We right now have the authorities and the funding to build a civilian response corps of 1,264. If we get some additional authorities without additional money, we can grow that to 2,264. And we'll have the 1,264 in less than a year. If we get the right authorities, which we hope to get sometime in the next 9 or 10 months, working things through Congress is not always so easy, we can grow within 8 to 12 months of getting those additional authorities, another 1,000. Then if we get additional funding and permission from Congress, we could grow to our medium-term goal of 4,264 civilians. If we grow to that number, 4,264, we'll be able to deploy and to keep in the field as many as 1,200 people in perpetuity. That would go a long way towards meeting our civilian needs in these national security crises. And from there we could go larger if it becomes apparent that that's too small. This has been a slow process. Again, I'm probably more frustrated than anyone. But it's also true that trying to do something new in Washington takes time. My folks did a timeline on the creation of SOCOM, Special Forces Command. And according to that timeline, which happens to be true, it took 7 years from the decision to create it. And that decision was due to the failure in the Desert One in Iran in April of 1980. It took 7 years to stand up SOCOM. Well, we stood up the Civilian Response Corps 2 years ago, so 4 years after our office was created. And here, 6 years after, we've got a corps of 944. So by Washington standards, we're moving along at a pretty fast clip, even though it's way too slow for me and for anyone who cares about our national security.
Next question. I have a couple over here, Chelsea.
As others said, thank you very much for coming. I asked this question in light of the important part of non-military operations. And in particular, the military tends to talk about conflict circumstances in phases. I'm interested in your thoughts about what you think the relationship should be in terms of supporting versus supported for different parts of the government during different phases, and in particular with the F process between USAID and Department of State, and between DoD and their resources during conflict and hopefully preventive conflict operations.
There was a paradigm that existed as we went into Iraq, which basically had the civilians coming in, I think it's called Phase 4, after the fighting has more or less stopped. By the time our office was created, or shortly thereafter, so I inherited this when I arrived 2 years after SCRS was stood up, we already understood that that concept was outdated, and you really needed to have civilian side represented from Phase 0, from the very beginning. And something that was implicit but not explicit in the concept that I inherited, and I made it explicit, was that the civilian capacity that we are developing has to be available for deployment at all stages of the operation, including alongside our troops when they first go in. And so that is very much part of our concept right now. We have doctrine, by the way, which makes us very unusual in the State Department. That's the most important point I need to make in response to your question. Now, regarding how you lash things up, we've created something called the Interagency Management System, which is supposed to be a system you would use for dealing with a stabilization crisis. It was approved 3 years ago at senior levels in the previous administration, and we've exercised it substantially, and it in fact would provide an answer to the question of how to organize for a complex civilian operation. But it hasn't really been used in systematic form in real crises because it flies in the face of the political culture in Washington, which is that when you have a civilian crisis, anyone with any authority makes a grab for it because that's sort of neat. Having said that, this system, even if it's not used as a whole, has provided the answer for linking up state and AID and the other civilians into a single team. The Civilian Response Corps is that single team. I mean, our office runs it, but it's made up of employees of 8 agencies. And those agencies train together. And we have begun now, as we are establishing this Corps in some number, to deploy them together. And coordination, the integration of effort is really almost second nature. I say almost because you still have within the agencies proper this tendency to pull things on a turf basis towards themselves. But we are eating away at that in our own little world. And it's proving to be effective, and it's understood by those who see it to be effective. For example, our office was not involved, well, actually, we had a distinct role, I wouldn't say a large role, in the response to the earthquake in Haiti. Now, in point of fact, to the extent it was a humanitarian disaster, there's no reason for us to be engaged, for reasons I've already discussed. But we were asked for help in standing up a state task force to look at needs beyond the humanitarian. And overnight, we produced 50 people to staff a very large task force from all the 8 agencies that make up the Civilian Response Corps. That was unheard of in State Department practice. So we are linking people together. And folks who come into our system from whatever agency are pulled into this, and generally speaking, they become advocates. So at this point, I would not say we are the answer at the macro level, at the level of bringing agency heads together, although the IMS could do that if it was ever empowered. But at the micro level, the practitioners on the ground, we're already the answer.
Okay, next question. We have one right here.
I wonder if you could talk about the situation in Somalia a little bit and what an agency like yours could bring to a situation like that.
Well, Somalia is perhaps the poster child of her failed state. So from that point of view, it's a natural place for us to be engaged. But it's also true that the United States has had an interesting relationship with Somalia going back to the early 90s. And so there's a certain reluctance to engage in a major way there. To the extent that the United States has been dealing with Somalia, our office is part of it. We have been running projects to promote stability using Pentagon funds. This was one of the concrete elements of support the Pentagon gave our office. They're called 1207 funds. We've been running projects with these Pentagon funds for over 3 years. And one of these projects was concerning Somalia. But given our skittishness about actually going into the country, these were more on the periphery, the border of the country. There has been increased attention to Somalia under the Obama administration, and we've been part of the conversation. I was in Nairobi last month, among other places, and I was talking to the special representative of the Secretary General, well, actually the deputy special representative, and he invited us to send a planner to work with his team for how the government in Mogadishu could reestablish some basic services once it conducts a military offensive. So we're now discussing that, so we may be involved in that. If there's a decision to go back to Somalia in some significant way, I think we'll be part of the planning for it, and our people who can deploy quickly may be part of that effort. But at this point, that's not in the cards. Although I'm not saying it couldn't happen in the future.
Other questions? One right here, Chelsea, right up front.
Thank you for being here, and I have 2 questions. The first question I would like to ask you about what kind of achievements that you have done, your office have done in Iraq. And I don't know if you have any activities regarding democratizing the Middle East or not.
We've done very, very little in Iraq. When the office was stood up, in fact, a decision was taken that we would not be engaged in Iraq because we had very limited resources which had to devote towards building the Civilian Response Corps, and there were plenty of resources in Iraq. But we have sent a few people to do very specific functions in Iraq. We sent people to support Ambassador Tim Carney when he went out as the principal economic supervisor. We've actually done a fair amount of training for people going out to our PRTs in Iraq, but that's really about it. We have not been engaged at all in the question of democratizing the Middle East. Our job is really to focus on conflict prevention and then stability operations. And I would say that, now what I'm about to say is, I would not say it's a formal policy, it's my view, that when we engage in conflict prevention, and especially when we do stability operations, we need to pursue policies which are relatively modest, which are completely consistent with the culture and the history of the places where we are engaging, and which will help local governments in those places establish effective governance consistent with their cultures. Otherwise, I think we're going to be setting ourselves up for failure.
Other questions? Adrian?
The armed forces have the planet divided up essentially into major commands. And I was wondering, for example, with CENTCOM or SOUTHCOM, does the State Department have an element in those commands? What is the relationship between the State Department and the major COCOM commands?
Well, all combatant commands have always had political advisors. And they have usually been ambassadors or someone who's almost at the ambassador level to provide direct political advice to the combatant commander, the 4-star. Starting about 3 years ago, the department decided that we needed to have political advisors at lower levels too, and including at, say, the battalion level. And you'd have a much more junior diplomat as the Apollo advisor at that level. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many political advisors we have now, but it's certainly many dozens, if not a couple hundred. And you can probably find that out on the State Department website. Now, as for our own office, we see combatant commanders as natural partners for us, and they see us as natural partners as well. But we are still very small. My office has been growing rapidly. When I came on board, we had 64 people in my office. We now have 189. Which makes us already not small by State Department standards, but still pretty much microscopic by Pentagon standards. So there are far more people in the Pentagon who want to play with us than we have to play. Having said that, we have a liaison officer at CENTCOM. Starting next month, we'll have a liaison officer at AFRICOM. We have run substantial exercises with SOUTHCOM and EUCOM, and we'll be doing exercises now which will culminate in a substantial exercise next year with AFRICOM. My plan is when I have a civilian response corps of a couple of thousand or more to have a liaison at every combatant command. And we are constantly being invited into combatant command planning exercises, which we want to do. We don't always have the people who can do it. We don't have the number of people, although we're developing our planning capacity nicely with help from the staff college here at Leavenworth. There's also a skittishness in the State Department that needs to be overcome about us planning together with the military. So we've had occasions where we've been invited in to do something on specific countries. We wanted to do it because it was obviously a smart thing to do, and we were told no because of chuckleheads in the State Department.
Okay.
I have a question concerning your service in Ukraine, especially during events Orange Revolution, and following that, I have read your numerous interviews and know your position basically. But since then, many things changed. So, looking back into perspective, there was at certain moment of Orange Revolution, there was a feeling of lacking vacuum of power and lack of legitimacy. So, of course, Ukrainian politicians were looking for external legitimation, and of course, they turned to many Polish, the neighboring countries, and American help for assistance in like making negotiations. So, assessing your role in that as an ambassador. And especially after these events, when the revolution, when the outcomes of revolution were not so good, do you think you could do something differently now than you done before, or maybe engage more or less? Thank you.
Okay. А вы сами откуда? Ukraine. Western Ukraine. Okay, interesting. I would characterize things a little bit differently than you. All right. It's interesting. I asked you where you were from because I would not say, I know there are people who would, but I would not say that the government that emerged from the Orange Revolution, from the third ballot of the presidential election in 2004, was looking for legitimacy from outside. I think that they won legitimacy by winning that third election, which was a fair one, where Yushchenko got over like 53 or 54% of the vote. It is true that one of the reasons, an important but not the sole reason, but one of the reasons why the second ballot was declared illegitimate was you had international observers using sophisticated methods saying that the election was stolen. But I mean, I was very active at the time, and it seemed to me the Ukrainian people as a whole let it be known that they had elected their president when Yushchenko took office. Now, of course, there were parts of the country, especially in the east, and to a lesser extent in the south, although certainly in Crimea, where people did not understand that the second round was falsified. But, I remember being in Kyiv even before the second round, between the first and second rounds, and seeing all the orange colors appearing everywhere. And it became apparent to me that the center of the country, meaning especially Kyiv, but not just Kyiv, the cities in the center, had made their choice. And of course, the West was enthusiastically for Yushchenko and Tymoshenko. But the election was won in the center. They did receive legitimation in the West, and they received it in the West in part because some of those Western countries, Poland being a good example, wanted to have a pro-Western partner, but also because, and now I'm speaking as an American diplomat representing the United States at the time, because we saw him as the democratic winner of a democratic election, and that gave him his legitimacy. Now, obviously, in parts east of Ukraine, there was a very different interpretation, but it was a seriously misguided interpretation. And it had an echo in eastern Ukraine and in the south. But, coming back to what I said earlier, the important thing that happened that December was that the Ukrainian people said they were not going to accept an imposed president. They were going to choose their own president. And that same people, the same Ukrainian people, got fed up with Mr. Yushchenko. And I can understand why they were fed up with Mr. Yushchenko. The policies of the past several years, to be diplomatic, were not particularly effective. And they tossed him out. And so the man who's now President, Mr. Yanukovych, won a democratic election. And congratulations to him. And congratulations to him also for playing by the rules, and to Mr. Yushchenko for establishing rules that were democratic. But just to make one more point, you didn't ask this question, but I think this is a concern you have, which was behind your question. I remember telling my staff at the embassy when Yushchenko won that this was an important milestone, but this really wasn't the victory of the good guys over the bad guys. Because I said, the same sort of people who make up the party that lost are in the party that won. And we saw that in the policies that were then pursued by the party that won in the Orange Revolution. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why people were disillusioned. Again, Yushchenko deserves a lot of credit for establishing an open society. And again, that's his historical achievement. But on the other side, things relating to corruption, well, his group, didn't look all that much better.
Do we have any other questions today? Last chance. John, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.